She thought he was just a starving, forgotten old man shivering in the snow, so she risked her job to give him a warm bowl of soup on Christmas Eve. But when her cruel manager fired her for theft and kicked her out into the freezing blizzard, neither of them realized the gravity of the mistake he had just made. What the manager didn't know was that the trembling man in the corner wasn't homeless at all. He was the most decorated general in the country's history, and he was about to call in the cavalry. Before we go back to that freezing night, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have a story that will make you believe in miracles again. The wind howled against the frosted glass of Miller's roadside diner like a wounded wolf. It was the kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin, it burrowed into your bones and made them ache. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to amplify the silence. It was 11:45 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The diner was empty, save for the smell of burnt coffee and the rhythmic squeak of Sarah's rag against the laminate counter. Sarah, a 30-year-old single mother with tired eyes and a uniform that had seen better days, checked her watch for the 10th time that hour. Her hands were red and chapped from the harsh cleaning chemicals, trembling slightly not from the cold, but from exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but her mind was miles away, in a small, drafty apartment where her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was sleeping. Lily had asked for a dollhouse this year. Sarah had barely managed to scrape together enough for a second-hand doll with one missing shoe. The guilt sat heavy in her chest, heavier than the tray of dirty dishes she was carrying. "Hey, you getting paid to dream or to clean?" The voice cracked like a whip. Sarah flinched, nearly dropping a coffee mug. Rick, the manager, emerged from the back office. He was a thick-set man who wore cheap cologne that smelled like pine car freshener. He was the kind of man who counted the sugar packets at the end of every shift to make sure no one was stealing. "Sorry, Rick," Sarah murmured, keeping her head down. "Just finishing up." "You better be," Rick sneered, tapping his phone. "I want this place spotless before you clock out. And don't think you're getting overtime just because it's a holiday. You're lucky I even kept you on after you were late last Tuesday." Sarah bit her lip, swallowing the sharp retort that rose in her throat. She needed this job. The heating bill was overdue, and the landlord had already given them a friendly reminder warning. "Yes, Rick, I know." Outside, the blizzard was intensifying. The snow was falling sideways, a curtain of white static erasing the world. Suddenly, the little brass bell above the entrance chimed. It was a weak, pathetic sound against the roaring wind. The door was pushed open, struggling against the gusts. A blast of freezing air rushed into the diner, instantly sucking out the warmth. Snow swirled across the checkered floor. A figure stumbled in. He was an old man, perhaps in his 70s, though the deep lines etched into his weathered face made him look older. He was wrapped in layers of tattered, mismatched coats that looked like they had been pulled from a dumpster. His boots were held together with silver duct tape, and his gray beard was matted with ice crystals. He shook violently, not just a shiver, but a full body tremor that rattled his bones. He stood by the door, afraid to step further onto the clean floor, his eyes darting around like a frightened animal. Rick looked up from the cash register, his face twisting into a scowl of pure disgust. "Oh, for God's sake," Rick groaned, slamming the register drawer shut. "Look at what the wind blew in. Hey, you! We're closed. Get out!" The old man didn't move. He couldn't. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his breath coming in shallow, ragged clouds. Sarah felt a pang in her heart. She looked at the old man and didn't see a vagrant. She saw a father, a grandfather, someone who had once been a baby held in someone's arms. "Rick, please," Sarah whispered, stepping out from behind the counter. "It's 20 below zero out there. Look at him. He's freezing to death." "Not my problem," Rick barked, walking around the counter to confront the man. "This is a business, Sarah, not a shelter for bums. If I let one in, they all come, like cockroaches." Rick marched up to the old man, looming over him. "Did you hear me, Pops? Take a hike. Go freeze somewhere else." The old man looked up. His eyes were a startling, piercing blue, contrasting with the redness of his wind-burned skin. There was a strange clarity in them, hidden beneath the exhaustion. He tried to speak, but his jaw was locked from the cold. All that came out was a dry, rasping sound. He reached out a hand that was scarred, calloused, and shaking uncontrollably towards the counter. He wasn't asking for money. He was pointing at the half-empty pot of coffee sitting on the burner. Sarah saw the gesture. She saw the desperation. Ignoring Rick, she grabbed a clean mug. "I'm going to give him a coffee, Rick. Just a coffee. It's Christmas Eve." "If you pour one drop of that coffee," Rick warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous low growl, "it's coming out of your paycheck. And that includes the cup fee." Sarah didn't hesitate. She poured the steaming black liquid. She didn't stop there. She grabbed 2 biscuits from the display case, the ones meant to be thrown out at midnight anyway, and put them on a small plate. She walked over to the shivering man, ignoring Rick's bulging eyes. "Here," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It's hot. Be careful." The old man looked at the coffee, then at Sarah. For a second, the trembling stopped. He looked at her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. It was a look of profound, silent gratitude. He took the cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his frozen palms before he even took a sip. "Thank you," he rasped. His voice was deep, gravelly, carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. It sounded like a voice that used to give orders, now reduced to begging for warmth. "Unbelievable," Rick shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "You just cost me $3, Sarah. That's it. I'm docking it. And you're staying an extra hour to scrub the grease traps." Sarah just nodded. She guided the old man to the corner booth, the one furthest from the door. "Sit for a minute," she told him. "Just warm up." The old man sat, his body slumping as the heat began to work. He took a bite of the biscuit, closing his eyes as if it were a gourmet steak. But Rick wasn't done. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the cops. I want him trespassed. I don't want his smell driving away the morning crowd." "Rick." "No," Sarah pleaded. "The morning crowd won't be here for 6 hours. Let him stay until the storm passes." "It's him or you, Sarah," Rick yelled, his face turning red. "You want to run a charity? Go do it on the street. You choose right now. Kick him out or you're fired." The diner went silent, save for the wind outside. Sarah looked at the old man, who had stopped eating. He was watching her, waiting. He looked so small in that big booth. Sarah thought of Lily. She thought of the rent. She thought of the doll with the missing shoe. Then she looked at the old man's hands. They were bleeding slightly from the cracked skin. She took a deep breath, untying her apron. The sound of the apron hitting the counter wasn't loud, but in the tense silence of the diner, it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. "I choose him," Sarah said. Her voice didn't shake this time. It was quiet, firm, and laced with a strange kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. Rick's jaw dropped. The vein in his forehead pulsed violently. You're choosing a bum over your paycheck. Over feeding your kid? You're fired, Sarah. Get your stuff and get out. And don't expect a reference." "I don't want a reference from a man who would let a veteran freeze to death," Sarah replied, grabbing her coat from the hook by the kitchen door. She felt a sudden lightness. The fear of the landlord, the bills, the debt, it was all still there, hovering in the back of her mind. But it was eclipsed by a burning sense of moral clarity. Rick sputtered, his face turning a shade of purple that clashed with his cheap tie. He stormed back into his office, slamming the door so hard the employees' must-wash-hands sign rattled against the wall. "I'm calling the sheriff! You're trespassing now!" he screamed through the wood. Sarah ignored him. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She walked back to the kitchen, not as an employee, but as a human being. On the back stove, there was a Tupperware container. It was her dinner, a homemade chicken and rice soup she had prepared for her break. It wasn't much. Just broth, some leftover rotisserie chicken, and vegetables that were on the verge of turning bad. But it was hot. She heated it up, the smell of thyme and onion wafting through the sterile air of the diner, battling the scent of stale grease. She poured it into a large ceramic bowl, added a side of crackers, and walked back to the corner booth. The old man was watching her. He hadn't moved. His blue eyes tracked her every movement with a laser-like focus that seemed out of place for a man in his condition. He wasn't looking at her like a starving man looks at food. He was looking at her like a soldier assessing a battlefield ally. Sarah slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl seat was cold, but the heat radiating from the bowl between them created a small island of warmth. "Eat," she whispered, sliding the spoon towards him. "It's not much, but it's homemade." The old man looked at the soup. Steam curled up into his face, melting the frost that still clung to his eyelashes. His hands, still trembling, reached for the spoon. He took a sip, then another. Then he began to eat with a voracious, desperate hunger that broke Sarah's heart. She watched him, noticing the details she had missed before. The way he held the spoon, not with a fist, but with a precise, disciplined grip. The scar running down his left cheek, jagged and old. The dog tags that clinked softly beneath his layers of rags every time he leaned forward. "Slow down," she said gently, instinctively reaching out and placing her hand over his wrist. Her skin was rough from work, but his was like leather toughened by decades of exposure. "You'll make yourself sick." The contact seemed to shock him. He froze, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at her hand on his wrist, then up at her face. For a moment, the fog of cold and exhaustion seemed to lift completely from his eyes. "You lost your job," he said. His voice was stronger now, the soup coating his throat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sarah pulled her hand back, giving him a sad, tired smile. "Jobs come and go. People don't." He was angry. The old man continued, nodding towards the office where Rick was yelling into a telephone. "You have family?" "A daughter," Sarah said, her eyes involuntarily darting to the clock. "Lily. She's 6. The old man slowly put the spoon down. He reached into the deep pocket of his inner coat. It took him a moment of fumbling, his frozen fingers struggling with the fabric. Finally, he pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it. Inside wasn't a stack of cash or a diamond. It was a small roll of bills, mostly 1s and 5s, damp and crumpled. It couldn't have been more than $40. It looked like money he had begged for, dollar by dollar, over weeks. He pushed the pile of crumpled bills across the table towards her. "Take it," he rasped. "For the girl. For Lily." Sarah stared at the money. $40. That was the electric bill. That was groceries for 3 days. That was the missing shoe for the doll. It was everything he had. The temptation was there, a primal survivalist urge to take it. But then she looked at his face. He was offering her his survival to pay for her kindness. Sarah firmly placed her hand over the money and slid it back to him. "No," she said. The old man frowned, confused. "It is not enough? I have a watch." He started to undo the cuff of his sleeve. "Stop," Sarah said, her voice sharp but kind. She reached across and took his hands in hers, stopping him from removing the watch. "I didn't give you that soup because I wanted to sell it to you," Sarah said, locking eyes with him. Her voice trembled with emotion. "And I didn't stand up to him because I wanted a tip." "Then why?" the old man asked, his brow furrowed. The world does not work for free." Sarah looked out the window at the raging blizzard. The snow was piling up against the glass, burying the world in white. "My father used to say that when the storm is loud, humanity has to be louder," she said softly, turning back to him. "Kindness isn't a transaction, sir. It's the rent we pay for being here. If I took your money, I wouldn't be helping you. I'd be charging you for being a human being. And I won't do that." The old man stared at her. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked down at his money, then back at Sarah. A single tear, hot and clear, cut a path through the grime on his cheek. He wasn't crying because of the cold. He was crying because he had forgotten. He had spent so long in the trenches, then in the halls of power, and finally on the streets, seeing the worst of humanity, the greed, the ambition, the apathy. He had forgotten what pure, unadulterated decency looked like. He slowly pulled the money back, nodding solemnly. He tucked it away with a reverence he hadn't shown before. "Sarah," he said, reading the name on her discarded apron on the table. He said it like he was memorizing coordinates for an airstrike. "You are a good soldier." "I'm just a mom," Sarah replied, standing up as she saw headlights flashing blue and red through the snowstorm outside. Rick burst out of the office, a triumphant, ugly grin on his face. "There they are," Rick shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the booth. "Officer, get in here. I want this trash removed, and I want her charged with theft for that soup." 2 police officers stomped in, shaking snow off their heavy tactical vests. They looked annoyed to be out in the storm, their hands resting on their belts. Sarah stood up, placing herself between the officers and the old man. "He's sick," she told the officers calmly, raising her hands. "He's just finished eating. Please let him rest for 5 minutes." "Step aside, ma'am," the taller officer said, his voice flat. "Rick says you're trespassing, both of you." The old man wiped his mouth with a napkin. He didn't look scared of the cops. In fact, as he stood up, the slouch in his spine disappeared. He rose to his full height, which was surprising. He towered over Sarah. He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. It wasn't a lean for support. It was a gesture of protection. "It is okay, Sarah," the old man said. His voice had changed. The gravel was still there, but the weakness was gone. It was replaced by a cold, steel timber. "We will go." He looked at Rick, who was smirking behind the counter. "You have made a decision tonight, son," the old man said to Rick. "Make sure you can live with the consequences." Rick laughed. "Get out of my diner, Grandpa, before I have them throw you in the back." The old man nodded once. He didn't look back at the warmth of the booth. He limped towards the door, into the biting cold that awaited them. Sarah grabbed her coat and followed him, stepping out of the light and into the darkness, leaving her livelihood behind on the laminate counter. The door swung shut. The bell chimed one last sad note, and outside, in the shadows of the parking lot, something stirred. The old man reached into his coat again, but this time, he didn't pull out money. He pulled out a black military-grade radio. The heavy metal door of the diner clicked shut, locking automatically. The sound was final, like the closing of a coffin lid. Sarah stood in the parking lot, the snow immediately assaulting her. The wind was ferocious now, a physical weight pushing against her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. The police cruiser sat idling for a moment, the officers watching them through the foggy glass to ensure they actually left, before peeling away into the whiteout, their taillights disappearing like dying embers. She was alone, just her, the old man, and the storm. "Sarah," the old man said. He was standing a few feet away, clutching his coat closed. The radio he had pulled out was gone, tucked back into the mystery of his rags. "You did not have to do that." Sarah spun around, her eyes red and stinging from the wind. The adrenaline of her defiance was crashing, replaced by a cold, suffocating panic. "I know," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I know I didn't have to, but I did." She hugged herself, her teeth chattering violently. "Please, there's a shelter on 5th Street. It's 3 blocks down. Just go. Please, before I regret this." The old man stepped forward, reaching out a hand as if to comfort her. "Sarah, listen to me. This night, it is not the end. It is a beginning. I need you to trust. I can't eat trust." Sarah snapped, the tears finally spilling over, hot and instant, freezing on her cheeks seconds later. "I can't pay rent with trust. I just lost the only income I have on Christmas Eve. I have a 6-year-old girl waiting for me, and I just threw her security away for a bowl of soup." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing into her frozen palms. The reality of her moral victory was crumbling under the weight of survival. The old man stopped. He looked at her with a pained expression, his jaw tightening. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to tell her that help was coming, that he wasn't who she thought he was. But he knew the rules of engagement. He couldn't expose his position yet, not until the extraction team was secure, not until he could do this right. "Go to your daughter," he said softly, his voice dropping to a command that sounded more like a blessing. "Go home, Sarah. Survive the night." He turned and began to walk. He didn't head toward the shelter on 5th Street. He walked straight into the tree line bordering the highway, into the darkest, deepest part of the woods. "Wait!" Sarah called out, wiping her eyes. "You can't go that way. You'll die out there." He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He simply vanished into the swirling wall of white snow, like a ghost returning to the fog. Sarah stood there for a moment, screaming into the wind, but he was gone. Defeated, Sarah turned and began the long trudge to the bus stop. But as she rounded the corner, she saw the taillights of the last bus fading into the distance. She had missed it by 2 minutes. She had to walk 2 miles in a blizzard. By the time Sarah's key turned in the lock of her apartment door, she couldn't feel her feet. Her toes were numb blocks of ice. Her hair was frozen stiff. She pushed the door open, stumbling into the stale warmth of the hallway. It smelled of old carpet and boiled cabbage. "About time," a voice croaked from the living room. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor who watched Lily, was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed. The TV was blaring a late-night infomercial. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Higgins," Sarah whispered, peeling off her wet coat. Her fingers were so stiff she could barely work the zipper. "The storm. The bus." "I don't care about the weather, Mrs." Higgins huffed, standing up. She was a woman who believed kindness was a weakness. "You said midnight. It's 1:15 a.m. That's overtime. And it's a holiday rate." Sarah froze. "Mrs. Higgins, please. I don't have extra on me. I can pay you the regular rate now, and I'll get you the rest on Tuesday when I get my tie." She stopped. She realized she wouldn't be getting her tips on Tuesday. She wouldn't be getting a paycheck on Friday. She had nothing coming. "No credit," Mrs. Higgins snapped, holding out a wrinkled hand. "Cash. Now. Or don't ask me to watch the kid again." Sarah closed her eyes. She reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. It was the money for the electric bill. It was every dollar she had to her name. She counted out the bills, 20, 40, 60. She handed them over. "There," Sarah said, her voice hollow. Mrs. Higgins snatched the money, counted it twice, and grunted. "Merry Christmas," she muttered sarcastically, brushing past Sarah and slamming the door behind her. Sarah locked the door and slid down against it, collapsing onto the floor. She sat there in the dark hallway, listening to the silence. She looked at her phone. One notification. It was a text message from the landlord. From Mr. Henderson, landlord, time 1:05 a.m. "Rick called me, said you got fired for theft and causing a scene with the police. My lease agreement is clear about criminal activity. I don't want trouble in my building. You have 3 days to vacate. I'm keeping the deposit." Sarah stared at the screen. The light from the phone illuminated her face pale, terrified, broken. Rick hadn't just fired her. He had called her landlord. He had scorched the earth. He wanted to destroy her completely. She stood up, her legs shaking, and walked into the bedroom. Lily was asleep, curled up under a thin pink blanket. She looked like an angel, her breathing soft and rhythmic. On the nightstand, next to Lily's bed, was a crude drawing made with crayons. It showed a stick figure Sarah and a stick figure Lily holding hands. Above them, in messy block letters, it read, "Mommy is my hero." And at the foot of the bed lay the Christmas present Sarah had wrapped in newspaper because she couldn't afford wrapping paper. The second-hand doll, the one with the missing shoe. Sarah looked at the doll. Then she looked at the eviction text. Then she looked at her sleeping daughter. A wave of nausea hit her. "I failed," she thought. "I tried to be a good person, and I failed her." She fell to her knees beside the bed, burying her face in the mattress so Lily wouldn't hear her scream. She cried silently, her body convulsing with the force of her despair. She had saved a stranger, but she had doomed her daughter. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the city. But Sarah didn't know that deep in the woods, the homeless old man hadn't frozen to death. He was standing in a clearing, the wind whipping his gray hair. He was holding the radio to his lips, the red light blinking in the darkness. "This is General Sterling," he said into the device, his voice commanding and clear. "Code red, location confirmed. Mobilize the unit. I want the convoy here at 0600 hours. And get me the Judge Advocate General on the line. I have a war to start." The heavy steel door of Rick's diner slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Sarah's bones. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent, frozen night. She stood there, shivering uncontrollably, clutching a small cardboard box containing a cracked coffee mug and a photo of her son Leo. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed, tearing through her thin, worn-out waitress uniform as if she were naked. The snow was falling harder now, transforming the dirty alleyway into a white, suffocating tomb. 5 minutes. That's all it had taken to lose everything. "Get off my property before I call the cops for trespassing," Rick's muffled voice shouted from the other side of the door, followed by the slide of the deadbolt. Sarah's knees gave way. She slid down the rough brick wall, collapsing into a heap on the icy asphalt. Tears streamed down her face, instantly freezing on her cheeks. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for Leo. Tonight was his birthday. She was supposed to bring home a small cake. Instead, she was bringing home unemployment and despair. "I'm sorry, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking, lost in the howling wind. "Mommy tried. Mommy really tried." She looked up at the gray, swirling sky, waiting for a miracle that she knew wouldn't come. She closed her eyes, preparing to stand up and face the long, freezing walk to the bus stop. But then, the ground beneath her began to tremble. At first, Sarah thought it was the shivering of her own body, but the vibration grew stronger, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that resonated in her chest. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't thunder, it was the sound of raw, mechanical power. Sarah opened her eyes. The alleyway, usually dark and smelling of old grease, was suddenly bathed in a blinding, blue-white light. Shadows stretched and twisted against the brick walls as the source of the light turned the corner. It wasn't just a car, it was a procession. First, two matte black SUVs, massive and imposing, rolled into the narrow street, their tires crunching over the snow with a predatory growl. They moved with a synchronized precision that screamed authority. Behind them, gliding silently like a shark through dark water, was a vehicle that didn't belong in this rundown neighborhood. A Rolls-Royce Phantom. Its polished black paint mirrored the falling snow like a dark universe catching stars. The chrome grille gleamed menacingly, parting the winter air with an arrogance that demanded silence. Sarah pressed her back against the freezing wall, her breath catching in her throat. Who is this? The back door of the diner flew open again. Rick stepped out, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, wearing just his shirt sleeves, clearly annoyed by the commotion. "Hey, you can't park here. This is a loading zone." Rick's voice died in his throat. The cigarette fell from his lips, his mouth hanging open in a silent O. He stared at the fleet of vehicles, his eyes darting from the SUVs to the Rolls-Royce. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a primal confusion. The engines cut off simultaneously. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Click-clack. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison. 4 men stepped out. They were giants, dressed in immaculate black trench coats, earpieces coiled behind their ears. They didn't look like police. They looked like a private army. They scanned the perimeter with cold, professional eyes, ignoring Rick completely. Then the rear door of the Rolls-Royce opened. A driver in a peaked cap stepped out, walked around the back, and held a large black umbrella over the open door. A polished leather shoe stepped onto the slushy pavement. Then a cane ebony wood with a silver handle shaped like a lion's head. Sarah gasped. She recognized the cane. The man who emerged wasn't the hunched, shivering figure she had served tomato soup to an hour ago. He stood tall, his spine straight as a steel rod. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than the diner itself. A cashmere scarf was draped effortlessly around his neck, but the eyes were the same, piercing blue, filled with an intelligence that could cut glass. It was the homeless man. It was Arthur. He adjusted his leather gloves, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and turned his gaze toward the shivering woman on the ground. He didn't look at the luxury cars. He didn't look at the trembling manager. He looked only at her. Rick stammered, taking a step back, his hands shaking. Sir, we're closed. Arthur ignored him entirely. He walked past the terrified manager as if he were a ghost. The snow seemed to part around him. He walked straight to Sarah, the heavy crunch of his expensive shoes the only sound in the alley. He stopped in front of her. The bodyguard with the umbrella moved instantly to shield them both from the snow. Arthur looked down, his expression unreadable, terrifyingly calm. He extended a gloved hand toward her. "Sarah," he said. His voice was no longer raspy and weak. It was a baritone rumble, commanding and warm. "I believe you forgot to take your tip." Sarah looked at his hand, then at his face, then at the stunned Rick frozen by the door. Her mind couldn't process the image. The world tilted on its axis. "Arthur?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached his eyes. "Arthur Sterling," he corrected gently, "chairman of Sterling Global Industries. And I believe, my dear, that we have some business to discuss regarding the management of this establishment." He turned his head slowly toward Rick. The smile vanished instantly. His face became a mask of cold, judicial fury. Rick swallowed hard, his back hitting the doorframe. He looked like a rat trapped in a corner by a lion. "Get up, Sarah," Arthur said, turning back to her, his voice softening again. "The car is warm." And no one, he paused, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "No one leaves a Sterling out in the cold." Sarah gripped Arthur's gloved hand. her fingers numb and red from the cold. As he pulled her up from the icy asphalt, the warmth radiating from him felt alien, like standing next to a furnace in the middle of a blizzard. But Rick wasn't done. The initial shock of the Rolls-Royce was fading, replaced by the stubborn, reckless arrogance of a petty tyrant who refuses to believe he's wrong. He saw Sarah standing next to this billionaire, and his face twisted into a sneer of disbelief. "Sir," Rick shouted, stepping off the curb, his voice shrill against the low rumble of the idling SUVs. He pointed a shaking finger at Sarah. "You need to be careful. You don't know this woman." Arthur stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He simply ceased movement, his back to Rick. The bodyguard holding the umbrella stiffened, his hand moving subtly toward the inside of his jacket. "She's a thief!" Rick yelled, emboldened by Arthur's silence. He looked toward the diner windows, where the customers and other waitresses were now pressed against the glass, watching the spectacle. He wanted an audience. He wanted to be the hero who exposed the fraud. "I just fired her for stealing company inventory. She's a liar and a charity case. She's probably trying to scam you right now." Sarah shrank back, the shame burning her cheeks hotter than the frostbite. She tried to pull her hand away from Arthur's, instinctively wanting to hide. I didn't," she stammered. Arthur tightened his grip on her hand. He didn't let go. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, Arthur turned around. He tapped his lion head cane on the pavement. Clack. "Stealing?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Yes, stealing." Rick nodded frantically, thinking he was winning. "She gave food away to some filthy hobo out back against protocol. I run a clean business here. We don't serve trash." The air in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur took one step forward. The streetlights reflected in his cold blue eyes. "That filthy hobo," Arthur said, his voice rising, resonating with the authority of a man who commands nations, "was me." Rick froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked, trying to reconcile the image of the dirty old man from an hour ago with the titan standing before him. "I have spent the last week undercover," Arthur continued, his voice booming now, ensuring every person watching from the windows could hear. "I wanted to see if there was any humanity left in this city. Everyone walked past me. Everyone looked away. Everyone except her." Arthur gestured to Sarah with his cane. "She gave me her own dinner. She warmed my hands with her own coffee. And you—" Arthur pointed the cane directly at Rick's chest, the silver lion's head gleaming. "You threw her into the snow for it." Rick stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing wind. I was just following policy, sir. It's corporate policy. The owners, The owners," Arthur interrupted. He snapped his fingers. One of the men in the black trench coat stepped forward instantly, holding a sleek leather document folder. He opened it and handed a single sheet of paper to Arthur. Arthur held the paper up. It flapped violently in the wind. "I made a phone call 10 minutes ago, Rick," Arthur said calmly. "As of 8:05 p.m. tonight, Sterling Global has acquired a controlling interest in the parent company of this diner chain." Rick's knees actually buckled this time. He grabbed the door handle to stay upright. "Which means," Arthur said, stepping closer, looming over the manager, "I am the policy." "Please," Rick whimpered, looking around at the bodyguards, then at Sarah. "I have a mortgage. And she has a son," Arthur roared, the anger finally breaking through his composure. The sound made the nearby customers inside the diner jump. "She has a son waiting for her, and you stripped her of her dignity on his birthday." Arthur ripped the paper in half and let the pieces fly away into the snowy night. "Hand over your keys, now." "Sir, now!" Trembling violently, Rick dug into his pocket and pulled out the ring of keys. He dropped them into Arthur's open palm. Arthur looked at the keys with disgust, then tossed them to the head of security. "Rick, you are terminated effective immediately. You are banned from this property, and from any property owned by Sterling Global. If I see you near Sarah again, my legal team will ensure you never work in this country again." Arthur turned to the bodyguard. "Escort him off the premises. He can walk home." "But my car keys are inside," Rick cried out. Arthur smiled coldly. "The diner is closed for the night. You can retrieve them tomorrow, if you can get past security." Two massive bodyguards stepped forward, grabbing Rick by the arms. They didn't drag him. They simply marched him away. past the staring crowd in the windows, pushing him out toward the dark, unlit end of the street. The diner staff inside were cheering. Sarah could see her friend, the cook, clapping his hands against the glass. Arthur turned back to Sarah. Fury vanished from his face, replaced by a gentle grandfatherly warmth. He took off his cashmere scarf and wrapped it around her neck. It smelled of expensive cologne and safety. "The trash has been taken out," Arthur whispered kindly. "Now let's go get that birthday cake for Leo." The silence inside the Rolls-Royce Phantom was absolute. The double-pane glass erased the howling wind and the chaos of the diner, replacing it with a serene, heavy quiet. The air smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. Sarah sat on the edge of the plush seat, afraid her worn-out uniform would stain the pristine interior. She was trembling, not from cold anymore, but from the adrenaline crash. "Drink this," Arthur said gently, pressing a bottle of water into her hands. "Breathe, Sarah. It's over." She looked at him. The homeless man she had pitied was gone. In his place was a titan of industry, yet his eyes were still the same kind and sorrowful. "Why?" Sarah whispered, gripping the bottle. "Why go through all that trouble? Why pretend to be homeless?" Arthur sighed, looking out the window as the city lights blurred past. "Because when you have money, Sarah, everyone wants something from you. They smile, they bow, they flatter. But I needed to know who would help a man who had nothing to offer but gratitude. I've been searching for an heir to my charitable foundation for 6 months. I found no one. Until tonight." The car didn't head toward the rich district. Instead, it turned toward the crumbling apartment complex where Sarah lived. Arthur had known her address before she even spoke it. When the massive car pulled up to the curb of the dilapidated building, the neighbors peeked out from behind torn curtains. The streetlights flickered overhead. "My son!" Sarah gasped, realizing the time. "The babysitter leaves at 9. I don't have the cake." "Check the seat next to you." Arthur smiled. Sarah turned. Sitting on the leather seat was a white box tied with a gold ribbon. It wasn't a cheap grocery store cake. It was a masterpiece from the city's finest patisserie, a chocolate cake with a sugar-spun race car on top. "I took the liberty of ordering it while you were detained," Arthur said with a wink. They walked up the stairs together, the billionaire with his cane and the waitress in her uniform. When Sarah opened the door to apartment 4B, the small, drafty room was dim. 6-year-old Leo was sitting on the floor, pushing a toy car with 3 wheels. He looked up, his eyes wide, fearing bad news. "Mommy?" Leo asked, his voice small. "Mrs. Higgins said you got fired. She said we have to move." Sarah choked back a sob. She rushed forward and scooped him up, burying her face in his neck. "No, baby, no. Everything is okay." Arthur stepped into the room. He looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the bucket catching a leak from the ceiling, and the sheer poverty that Sarah had fought so hard to keep at bay. His jaw tightened. Leo looked at the tall stranger in the fancy coat. "Who is that?" Arthur stepped forward and bowed slightly, treating the 6-year-old with the respect of a king. "I am Arthur," he said softly. "I'm a friend of your mother, and I believe this belongs to you." He signaled to his bodyguard, who brought in the cake box. Leo's eyes went wide, but Arthur wasn't done. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the wobbly kitchen table. "Sarah," Arthur said, his tone shifting to business, "I meant what I said about the diner. I bought the chain, but I don't need a manager." He pushed the envelope toward her. "Inside that envelope is the deed to this building. I bought it 10 minutes ago." "I'm not finished," Arthur had said, his eyes twinkling in the dim light of the apartment. He placed a second document on the table next to the deed. "I am 80 years old, Sarah. My board of directors only cares about profit margins. They don't care about the people freezing in the alleys. I need a partner, someone who knows what it feels like to be hungry." He tapped the paper. "This is a contract, not for a waitress, but for the CEO of the Sterling Hope Foundation. Your first project? Revamping that diner into something that actually matters." Sarah looked at the contract. The salary figure had too many zeros. She looked at Leo, then at Arthur. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on her chest vanished. She picked up a pen. Music swells. An uplifting orchestral melody begins to build. The next few weeks were a blur of motion, color, and light. Week 1. The home. The first transformation happened in the apartment. A team of contractors paid for by Arthur didn't just fix the leak. They tore down the rot. Visual. The peeling gray wallpaper was stripped away, replaced by warm cream colors. Visual. The empty fridge was replaced by a stainless steel double-door model stocked to the brim with fresh fruit, milk, and the biggest birthday cake Leo had ever seen. Micro moment. Sarah sat on a brand new velvet sofa, wrapping a thick blanket around Leo. The radiator hummed with heat. For the first time in winter, they didn't have to wear coats inside. Week 2. The diner. The scene shifted to the street corner. A crane was parked outside the diner. Action. 2 workmen with crowbars ripped the neon Rick's Diner sign off the wall. It crashed into a dumpster with a satisfying shatter. New sign. A new sign was hoisted up. It was hand-painted wood, warm and inviting. The open table. Underneath, in smaller letters, "No one eats alone." Inside, Sarah stood in the center of the room, wearing a sharp navy blazer, holding a clipboard. She wasn't taking orders. She was giving them. The dark, greasy booths were ripped out, replaced by long, communal oak tables. The kitchen was gleaming. Week 3. The rehiring. Sarah stood by the back door, the same door she had been thrown out of. The lineup. A line of people waited. Not just strangers, but the old staff. The cook, the dishwasher, everyone Rick had bullied. The moment. Sarah shook the cook's hand. He was tearing up. She handed him an apron that was crisp and clean. She wasn't just their boss. She was their savior. Week 4. The grand opening. The night of the opening was the coldest night of the year, but the diner was glowing like a beacon. The crowd. There were no bodyguards at the door. The doors were wide open. Businessmen in suits sat next to construction workers. And in the corner booth, the best seat in the house, sat a group of homeless men and women. The policy. A sign on the wall read, "If you can pay, pay forward. If you can't pay, your meal is on us." Sarah moved through the crowd, pouring coffee. She stopped at the corner booth. An elderly man, shivering and looking terrified, looked up at her. He looked exactly like Arthur had looked that fateful night. "I don't have any money, miss," he whispered, ready to leave. Sarah smiled the same warm, defiant smile she had given Arthur. She placed a steaming bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich in front of him. "This is the open table, sir," she said softly. "Your money is no good here, but your company is." Across the room, sitting quietly at a small table near the window, Arthur watched. He was sipping tea, watching Sarah work the room with grace and authority. Leo was sitting opposite him, drawing a picture of a lion. Arthur took a deep breath. His hands, usually trembling with age, were steady. He looked at the bustling room, the laughter, the steam rising from the plates, the dignity restored to the faces of the poor. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer. "It's done, James," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've found her. The legacy is safe." He looked at Sarah one last time, a single tear tracking through the wrinkles of his cheek. He had saved her life, yes, but looking at the life she had brought into this cold building, he realized she had saved him too. The snow was falling again in the city, just as hard as it had that fateful night, but this time, no one was shivering outside the building on 4th Street. The dilapidated structure that once housed Rick's Diner was gone. In its place stood a gleaming 4-story glass and brick building. Above the entrance, bronze letters glowed warmly in the winter night. The Arthur Sterling Center for Humanity, headquarters of the Open Table Foundation. Inside, the Grand Hall was filled with the city's elite mayors, senators, and CEOs. But intermingled with the tuxedos and gowns were people in worn-out coats, families who had lost their homes, and veterans who had lost their way. Tonight, they all ate at the same tables. Sarah stood at the podium. Her hair was silver now, tied back in an elegant bun. She wore a tailored suit, radiating a quiet, powerful grace that commanded the room. 15 years ago, Sarah began, her voice echoing through the silent hall, I thought I had lost everything. I had $4 in my pocket and a heart full of fear. She looked down at the front row. Sitting there was a young man, 21 years old, wearing a graduation gown from Harvard Law School. It was Leo. He wasn't the scared boy pushing a broken toy car anymore. He was strong, sharp, and had the same kind eyes as his mother. Next to Leo was an empty chair. On it sat a folded charcoal wool coat and a cane with a silver lion's head. Arthur had passed away 3 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, holding Sarah's hand. I met a man, Sarah continued, her eyes glistening, who pretended to be empty so he could show me how full I was. He taught me that the measure of a life isn't in the duration, but in the donation. She gestured to the screen behind her. A map appeared, showing 500 red dots across the country. Today, we are opening our 500th open table kitchen. We have served 10 million meals. We have housed 50,000 families. And my son, Leo. Leo stood up, tears streaming down his face. The crowd erupted in applause. Leo will be taking over as the Director of Legal Aid, ensuring that no worker is ever wrongfully fired and no mother is ever thrown out into the cold again. After the gala, the guests filtered out. The lights dimmed. Sarah and Leo walked out into the snow, standing on the exact spot where the old alley used to be. The wind howled, a ghostly reminder of the past. Leo opened a large black umbrella and held it over his mother, just as Arthur's driver had done for him years ago. He would have loved the speech, Mom, Leo said softly. Sarah smiled, pulling Arthur's old cashmere scarf tighter around her neck. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small old photo. It was a picture taken the day the first diner opened. Arthur, Sarah, and little Leo, all laughing over a slice of chocolate cake. He didn't just give us money, Leo, Sarah whispered, looking up at the swirling snow. He gave us our humanity back. She looked at the spot where she had once collapsed in despair. He asked me for a cup of coffee, she said, her voice trembling with finality. And in return, he gave us the world. Voice_ID WBUBixen 0 Artit 25. Collapsed in despair. He asked me for a cup of coffee, she said, her voice trembling with finality. And in return, he gave us the world. Voice_ID WBUBixen 0 Artit 25.